Hi, good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all. We've had a little glitch in our programming for tonight, so thank you for understanding. Senator Manchin, who was supposed to be with us last night, was informed about a vote that was going to be taking place this evening. You'll be able to ask the amazing Ron Brownstein about that vote, because I believe it's moot, or at least won't be held tonight. But we are blessed with an incredible pinch hitter. And I want to thank him very much for standing in for Senator Manchin. And of course, thank you to Warren Olney, who pivoted on a dime to be able to accommodate a new schedule. So one of the great things about being involved in this enterprise is I get to work with amazing other volunteers. And the next one who's going to speak to you is my old friend and a legend in LA. Zev Yaroslavsky is going to give you some information about some of the programs coming up over the next several weeks. Zev?
Thank you, Janice, and thanks for all the work you and David Laird do to facilitate this remarkable series. I want to thank our loyal audience, which sustains us through your weekly attendance and your financial donations. We are all volunteers in this project, so every nickel you donate enables us to bring you the superstar cast of speakers like the one we are going to hear from tonight, Ron Brownstein. We will continue presenting these programs as long as you attend and sustain us. In other words, as long as you want us to. As we get started, I want to remind you of our next few Wednesday evening America at a Crossroads programs. Next Wednesday, we'll have Professor Rick Hasson of the University of California, Irvine, and Debbie Lithwack, a senior editor at Slate, in conversation on the topic, the United States Supreme Court docket. Don't miss that program. In 2 weeks, on October 20th, Noah Feldman, one of America's leading scholars of constitutional law and democracy, will be in conversation with Larry Diamond, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, on the subject, the trajectory of our American democracy. In 3 weeks, October 27th, we will have a return visit from George Will, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author, who will discuss the political and social factors that made the last 12 years such an unsettling and consequential era. And our own Warren Olney will be in conversation with George Will that night. And finally, we are pleased to announce that on Wednesday, November 3rd, Judge will welcome back Congressman Adam Schiff of California. He chairs the House Intelligence Committee, of course, was one of the lead impeachment manager in the first impeachment of Donald Trump, and a very consequential member of the House of Representatives. Don't miss that one. That'll be November 3rd. Now it's my privilege to introduce my good friend and partner in the America at a Crossroads project, former Congressman Mel Levine, who will introduce our distinguished guests for the evening. Mel?
Thanks very much, Zev. And I share your gratitude to our colleagues, Janice and David, and also to you, Zev. It's a pleasure working with the three of you. We warmly welcome and greatly appreciate Ron Brownstein's return. Ron really needs no introduction to our audience for any number of reasons, both due to his long and distinguished tenure at the Los Angeles Times, where he was chief political correspondent, and also his trenchant regular analyses in the Atlantic, not to mention his previous appearances here. Ron is also a senior political analyst for CNN, two-time Pulitzer finalist for his coverage of presidential campaigns. And I should note that we highly recommend his recent book, Rock Me in the Water, 1974, The Year Los Angeles Transformed Movies, Television, and Politics. Similarly, Warren Olney needs no introduction to our audience. He is our most frequent host. He's the recipient of over 40 local, regional, and national awards on both TV and radio for NPR and PBS stations. His colleagues have appropriately bestowed on him their Lifetime Achievement Award, which he richly deserves. So with that, Warren, take it away.
Mel, thanks a lot. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be on this program, and I enjoy very much working with all of you. But I beg your pardon. And I want the audience to know that I will be given questions that you submit. They will be put on my cell phone, and in a half hour or so, I will start asking those. But first, I'm going to ask the questions. And Ron, it's great to have you on the program, of course. We've done a lot of these together and other programs as well, and I feel very familiar with you, and it's a lot of fun to be back. And I see your book is on the shelf in back of you, and I would recommend it to people as well. So your latest column is titled Why the Senate Doesn't Work Anymore, and it seems to me that is in fact the issue of the day. I want to get there as soon as possible, but I think we need to bring our people up to date. First of all, the Senate Democrats had scheduled that vote that Senator Manchin couldn't afford to miss, but they called it off. And the reason they called it off is that the minority leader, Mitch McConnell, had made them an offer of some kind. It's about raising the debt limit and protecting the full faith and credit of the United States. The Democrats now have agreed to take more time deciding what they want to do. I beg your pardon, in response to what the senator said. And I want to talk to you about what their problem is. But first of all, let's just talk for a moment about what this means. How serious is it to fool around politically with the full faith and credit of the United States?
Well, Warren, great to be with you. And first of all, let me just thank our audience and our fellow leaders of this organization for being here tonight. I would have thought a Dodger postseason game qualified as one of the high holy days. So it's great that everybody is here, and I look forward to the conversation. And I have a sneaking feeling that Joe Manchin didn't want to miss first pitch. Well, look, it is serious. I mean, we have been down this road before, obviously, with Ted Cruz and Obamacare in the Obama administration. It is part of the overall escalation of political tactics, particularly among Republicans, who are using kind of every kind of chink and kink in the constitutional system to try to exercise majority power from a position of the minority. That's the way I think to understand all of this. I mean, even the California recall was another manifestation of that. How do you exercise majority power while you are the minority? Mitch McConnell has created, as he often does, a new rule. You know, his rule is that when you have unified control of government, the majority power should have to raise the debt limit alone. The majority party should have to raise the debt limit alone without any participation by the minority party. That part isn't so unique. When the Republicans had unified control of government in 03, 04, and 05 under George W. Bush, all or virtually all Senate Democrats also voted against raising the debt limit. The twist that McConnell has added, as he often does, is that while he says the majority party should have all the responsibility to raise the debt ceiling, the minority party should maintain a veto over whether they do so through the filibuster. You know, they talk about how Biden or Obama or others voted against raising the debt ceiling under Bush. That's true. They did not veto. They did not prevent the majority party from acting to do so. They made their point, they cast their symbolic vote of opposition, but they did not actually gamble with the full faith and credit of the United States. And to me, what McConnell is doing is really, it crystallizes why the filibuster has become even more pernicious today than it has been in earlier decades. Because the logic that McConnell is laying out, on one part, I think is basically correct. He is saying we are in a parliamentary world now. We are in a quasi-parliamentary system in the US where the majority party governs, and the role of the minority party is not to cut deals with them, it's to oppose what they do and to try to become the majority party themselves. That's how parliamentary systems work. The Tories don't go to labor for votes to pass their program. But every other parliamentary system in the world operates with majority rule. By definition, a parliamentary system is based on majority rule. And the filibuster has given us an outlier in the world. It has given us a parliamentary system without majority rule. And as we are watching time and again, that is a contradiction in terms. It just doesn't work. And so what McConnell did today was kind of punt the issue down till December, saying that Republicans will let them raise the debt ceiling on a majority vote, although whether he can enforce that in his caucus, I assume he can, but that we're going to have to revisit this whole question in December. The last point is that McConnell is kind of holding a gun metaphorically speaking, to the head not only of the Senate Democrats, but of the whole world economy. Democrats could choose to take that weapon away from him at any point. They could do that now while this vote was supposed to happen. They could vote with 50 votes plus the Vice President Kamala Harris to exempt the debt ceiling from the filibuster, and they are choosing not to do that. In fact, it may be that the main reason McConnell took this step back and kind of, made this concession was because he worried that conversation was getting more serious about doing that, and he doesn't want the precedent. But that is the fact. Democrats are basically providing McConnell the weapon that he is using against them, and it's not even really Democrats. It's two Democrats. One of whom was supposed to be here tonight, Joe Manchin, and the other one, Kyrsten Sinema.
President Biden says, I got 50 people and I got 48 of them. All I need is 2 more.
Yeah.
That's a big ratio, 48 to 2.
Yes. Well, he's right. But as I wrote in a piece that came out yesterday on CNN.com, I think this is really indicative of kind of the modern world. Don't forget, I mean, this situation is different in some ways, but it's really not completely different from what Trump and McConnell faced in 2017, when virtually every Republican in both chambers wanted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And most Republican voters did as well, even if the overall public of the country was not. And they were stopped because 3 senators said no. I mean, they also had 48 who said yes at that point, and they couldn't do it. And what I wrote was that we are in a world where the Senate, like the country, is now both more closely divided, but also more deeply divided. Since 2000, so these last 11 Senates, one party or the other have reached 55 or more Senate seats only 3 times, right? So the majority has been below 55 in 8 of the 11, or has reached 55 in only 3 of the 11s in 2000. If you go back from 1980 to 2000, one party or the other reached 55 seats 7 times. From 1960 to 1980, one party or the other reached 55 seats 9 times. Okay, so it is getting harder for either side to get much above 50. Small Senate majorities, in the 51, 52, maybe 53 range are becoming the rule. But at the same time, so you start off further from 60, the 60 that you need to break a filibuster than you used to. But at the same time, as the majority party's number of seats is getting lower, it's also getting harder to get votes from the other party for your top priorities. I mean, every Senate Republican voted against the Affordable Care Act. Every Senate Democrat voted against repealing the Affordable Care Act. Every Senate Democrat voted against the Trump tax cut. Every Senate Republican is opposing the reconciliation bill. And both of these things are combining to create a situation in which the only way that a president can pass their program is both to load as much of it as they can into reconciliation, the only way to evade the filibuster, and then achieve near total, or in this current case of 50-50, absolute total unity among their own party. And again, that's what you expect in a parliamentary system. But in a world where you only have 50 Senate seats, or 51 really, as the Republicans did in 27 to 2019, it's kind of the Huey Long campaign slogan from the 1930s, every man a king, or also including every purple wig, triathlete, bisexual freshman senator from Arizona a king. They're all kings. And so I think this is like kind of, this is more, obviously this is rooted in the personal political calculations and ideological idiosyncrasies of Manchin and Sinema. But it is more, this is the reality of how you have to pass things now, because you have near total opposition from the other party, and you have tiny majorities, you need near total unity in your own party, and that's never easy. And by the way, we could talk about both of these forces, both of these dynamics, smaller majorities, less support from the opposite party, are driven fundamentally by the same thing, which is that there is an increasing alignment between the way states vote for president and the way they vote for senator. And I can explain that later or whenever, if you want. But that same dynamic is what's making the Senate more closely divided and more deeply divided.
I will give you a chance to talk about that later, but first of all, I just want to ask this. There doesn't seem to be much concern about the voters. For example, you mentioned the ACA, and yes, the Republicans wanted to repeal it, but I think that many of them are relieved now that they weren't able to repeal it.
Yes. Because,
of course, it's extraordinarily popular. Similarly, the things that are on the Democratic bill, in the Democratic bill, are things that are enormously popular, including in West Virginia. I don't know about Arizona, but that's certainly true in West Virginia, according to polls that I have seen. So why is it worth it to take the kinds of risks that we're talking about, particularly when the full faith and credit of the United States is concerned, and when, if in fact things go badly, first it's going to be public employees that don't get paid, and then it's Social Security recipients, and next it's everybody that gets Medicaid or the Medicaid insurance program. At what point did it get so serious and that they were willing to risk such all important things? It's as if they don't want to govern.
Well, it's a really great question. And I think that the debt ceiling is different than reconciliation. That they're two different.
Explain reconciliation then.
Well, reconciliation is the big Biden budget. As I said, in a world where everything is filibustered, the parties have increasingly loaded all of their priorities into this one bill called reconciliation, a process created under the 1974 Budget Act in the period when Congress was taking power back from the executive branch. It was one of the post-Watergate reforms in which Congress was trying to regain control of the budgetary process from the Nixon administration, who had impounded funds. And they created this very complex process, which Mel could probably explain better than either of us, called reconciliation, the upshot of which is that it allows you to pass a program that affects the federal budget through the Senate on a simple majority vote. It is your biggest, best opportunity to evade the filibuster. Obviously, we've created other workarounds to the filibuster since then for judicial appointments, Supreme Court appointments, executive branch appointments. I think Fred Wertheimer, the founder, used to be the head of Common Cause, says there are like 170 specific exemptions to the filibuster. Reconciliation is the biggest one. And that is where Democrats are kind of shoehorning, as we'll talk about, so much of the Biden agenda into that one bill. Logically, the reconciliation bill would probably be 3 or 4 bills. I mean, there'd be a clean energy bill / research and development. There'd be a Medicare, Medicaid, ACA bill, and there'd be a kind of support for working families bill, children's tax credit, childcare subsidies, universal pre-K, universal free community college. But they can't, because they only get one reconciliation, or perhaps 2, depending on how it's structured, a year. So it's all together in one bill. I think that, look, the public opinion is exerting a force in that, as we've said, as the president said, he has 48 out of 50 Democratic senators. And in the House, even though there are disagreements, no one has any, I don't think there's any Democrat who doubts they could reach a deal among themselves. They can find a number. That's what politicians do. Between the 3.5 trillion that Bernie Sanders wants and the 1.5 trillion that Joe Manchin wants, there are lots of ways where we could talk about how to get to a number.
I'm talking about roughly 2, something like that.
Right. And there's lots of ways to do that. But the problem is, for Democrats, is that Manchin, for pretty understandable reasons, and Sinema for less understandable reasons, have decided that the core of their brand, the center of the way they are branding themselves, is as the Democrat willing to stand up to other Democrats, that they are the one who tell the, quote, crazies in the party no. They always have to be seen as taking their pound of flesh and standing in the way of what the bulk of the party wants. That's how they, for Manchin's case, can make the argument that you can elect me, even though this is a state that voted for Trump by 40 points. I am not like one of those other Democrats. I am someone who is holding back their excesses. And obviously people have written many times that Sinema seems to see herself in a McCain-like mode of doing something. And the same, someone in the administration said to me the other day that, you know, the way Joe Manchin works, like we should have said we wanted a $6 trillion bill, because then he would have said he wanted a $3 trillion bill. It's not a, you know, it's not a fundamental policy philosophical difference. It's a need to be seen as putting a brake on these crazy Democrats. And I think that's the problem on reconciliation, is that the public opinion obviously has had an influence in that we are seeing levels of agreement that would have been unimaginable in earlier generations. I mean, 48 out of 50 senators probably would vote for 3.5 trillion, and there might not be 218 House members, but you could, you know, 2.75 could pass the House probably. But you just have some members who made a different political calculation. And when you're starting at 50-50, those idiosyncrasies matter.
What about the Republicans, and how can the Republicans speak to their own constituents if in fact they are at the point of no return, as it were, with the national debt and all of the things that even Republicans need from the federal government, and not to mention the world economy?
I have a short answer. They have concluded identity trumps policy. And they were heading in this direction before Trump, but Trump, I think, solidified the belief that the glue that holds together the Republican coalition is hostility to the changes remaking American life culturally, demographically, and economically. And they believe that they can discredit any Democratic policy, even those that directly benefit their own constituencies, as a step toward transforming America into something unrecognizable, either a socialist country or this kind of PC, woke, multicultural threat to your America. Don't forget, I talked about with this last time, I think, that when Donald Trump went down to Georgia after the election for those 2 rallies he did for the Republican Senate candidates, at one of them, in front of a virtually all white rural audience, he said, "This is our America, and they are trying to take it away from us through stealing." So the repeal of the ACA, for example, was directly hostile to the interests of the older and non-college whites who are the core of the modern Republican coalition. If you look at Medicaid expansion at the states between the coasts, the most people who got coverage were not Black people in cities, it was white people, non-college white people. If you look at hospital systems, rural hospitals in communities that are getting more and more red all the time, are more dependent on Medicaid, Medicare, and the ACA than the hospitals in big cities, because fewer people in rural America have employer-provided health coverage. And yet they were confident that they could sell repealing it as a way of you know, stepping back from the brink of a socialist transformation of America. And that's the bet they're making. And by the way, which Manchin and Sinema are helping them make, facilitating them making on the Biden economic agenda. The Republicans don't want to argue about the individual programs in the agenda: universal pre-K, this child tax credit, $300 a month, paid family leave, more money for elder care, universal community college, because many of those programs poll well even with blue collar and older whites. What they want to do is focus entirely on the whole, not the individual parts, on the cost, on the idea that this is, as they say every day, transforming America into a socialist country. And Manchin has been right there with their talking points. I mean, everything he says about the bill, while he, in the end, will vote for something that's probably pretty substantial, because that's the way he does these things. He's rhetorically a tiger, and then he does find a way to get to something like what most Democrats want, usually, not always, but usually. I mean, his entire message about the bill is it's costs too much and it's the entitlement mentality, right? So that's the art. Republicans feel like as long as they can argue on the level of theory to some extent, or the kind of the whole, they can turn their voters against this bill when it counts. And Democrats will not get the benefit they expect. I mean, as I've written, this is the ultimate test of an argument that's been going on in the Democratic Party since Bill Clinton, which is, can you win back blue collar white voters who are drawn to Republican messages on culture and race by offering them material benefits? And now the same question applies even to some Hispanic, conservative Hispanic men. Same question. Can you win them back? If you make their life easier, if you give them more money to help pay for their kids' sneakers and for their parents' care and paid family leave, can you win them back if they are drawn to Republican messages about Democrats transforming America into something unrecognizable? I think that's really hard to do. And Republicans are betting they can't, and that's why they feel comfortable opposing these bills.
Are there Democrats, as the president, or up until now at least, been letting the Republicans get away with something because they allow them to talk about these huge figures that you mentioned, but the 3.5 billion or whatever it turns out to be is over 10 years. And if you talk about it on a program basis and how much it would cost per year, and then mention the way in which they have offered to or proposed to raise the taxes by taxing rich people who don't pay their fair share. We just saw a new story about that today, that it's even worse than we thought, and some corporations that don't pay anything at all. If that's where you get the money, and it's not all that much per year per program, isn't that the way to sell the program, sell the package?
Well, first, I mean, the totality is a lot. I mean, 350 billion a year is a much bigger increase in federal spending.
Everett Dirksen, pretty soon you're talking about real money.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, it is much bigger than Clinton or Obama ever attempted. I mean, this is a major expansion. The reason the bill is so expensive is it's because, as I said, it should be multiple bills. It's trying to do two things at once. It is trying to reinvigorate public investment, which is defined as federal investment in education, infrastructure, and R&D, which has been shrinking as a share of GDP for like 30, 40 years. And it is probably the biggest infusion of money into the federal investment in the building block of a future productive economy that we have seen since the Sputnik era. I think most economists would say it is the big. At the same time, it's a big expansion of the social safety net. I mean, adding dental, vision, and hearing to Medicare is a $260 billion proposition over a decade. Okay. Children's tax credit, expanded earned income tax credit, dependent care tax credit, which is the child care tax credit. I mean, that's like another 600 billion. What's that?
You got the money to pay for it.
Yes, but I'm saying it is a big leap at once. I mean, I even if it's paid for, it will increase federal spending as a share of GDP, along with revenue, more than Obama did and more than Clinton did. I mean, it is a change. But yeah, I mean, you know, the idea of creating pre-K, a monthly, in effect, European-style child allowance for families paid for by taxing corporations and the rich who have seen their tax rates, you know, tumble over the last really 40 years since the Reagan tax cuts in '81, is broadly popular in the country. And, Democrats are hoping that if they can do this program, they can go to voters in 2022 and say, here's what we did, keep us in power. I think it's more likely to help them in 24 than 22 if they can do it. But again, like, their problem is not macro public opinion. Their problem are two Democratic senators who are making different calculations than 99% of the party.
Okay, we got to talk about voting rights and all that's happening at the local level, or I should say the state level, and the provisions that even Manchin have been willing to go along with in terms of the need for the federal government to step in such a way that democracy itself isn't destroyed by the way that these local state laws allow people or allow legislatures to behave. For example, saying after the voting official has said that X won the election, saying, I'm sorry, we don't agree with that, and taking over the election procedure by elected officials who were in fact part of the very election that was involved. I'm sorry, I was a little clumsy in stating that, but you know, of course, what I mean. issue as well. Do you think that now Manchin, maybe Sinema, would be willing at least to make an exception in the case of voting rights because of the terrible threat to democracy itself in this country?
The short answer is that everyone hopes so on the Democratic side, and no one knows. No one knows. I think it is clear that if you look at the totality of everything that is happening, we are facing the greatest threat to American democracy, our basic constitutional system since the Civil War. You have multiple fronts advancing at once. You have red states passing bills that are making it tougher to vote in Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Iowa, Montana, one after the other. I believe 19 states have passed at least something, of which there are about 8 or 9 that are significant constrictions on the right to vote, often targeting specific programs that were used to increase turnout in minority areas and in large urban areas. And in that sense, this is all part of the struggle between rural-based Republican majorities in red states and blue trending metros in the red states. So the first prong, this assault on the right to vote, certainly the biggest since the 1880s and 1890s after Republicans in 1876 agreed to pull the troops out and end Reconstruction. Second, as you noted, a whole series of measures designed to expand political, in red states, to expand political control, meaning Republican Party control over the counting of votes or the administration of election, to take away authority from nonpartisan election administrators and to grant it shift it either to political entities or authorizing more aggressive intimidation tactics from poll watchers and kind of Republicans who would be kind of deputized to intimidate voters presumably heavily in minority areas. Third, Republicans who subscribe to the big lie about Trump and who kind of profess the need for greater clampdown on voting rights, running for all sorts of voting offices, whether it's county recorders or Secretary of States. So, and fourth, the open discussion among Republicans, as we saw in the John Eastman memo, about finding, who is from a college in California, about finding ways, if all else fails, if all this fails, and you still have a Democrat certified as winners in 2024, allowing state legislatures and or governors to simply disregard that, say that it's in dispute, we can't send a slate of electors, and then hope that a Republican majority House, and it doesn't even have to be a majority, it just has to be a majority of the delegations is the way that it works, which Republicans would likely have, overturn that result. So from at least 4 fronts, and if someone from the Brennan Center was here, I'm probably leaving one out, extraordinary, convergence of threats. Democrats have prepared legislation that doesn't respond to all of this yet. The Electoral Count Act is something they haven't gotten to, but this HR 1 that passed the House, that Manchin blocked along with the filibuster in the Senate, but which Democrats, including Manchin, then renegotiated to a surprisingly robust bill that is now out there, presumably supported by every Democrat, would respond and reverse and counter a lot of this. It would provide universal automatic voter registration for every state, same-day registration in at least one location in every county in the country, universal on-demand, on-request absentee ballots, universal early voting. 50 Senate Democrats will likely vote for this. No Senate Republicans will likely vote for this. Chuck Schumer has said to Manchin, look, Mr. Bipartisan, go find us 10 Republicans to vote for this. And already the most likely targets, people like Collins and Murkowski and Romney have said, no, they will not support any federal floor of voting rights. So some point after this reconciliation fight is done, the crunch time is here. I mean, at that point, either Manchin and Sinema allow the Republicans in the Senate to basically provide air cover to the ground offensive of Republicans in the state, or they step up and try to, I am probably one of the last Walking Dead fans in the world, but like in one of the communities in Walking Dead, the walls that have lasted for 10 years are falling apart and they keep trying to buttress them, with like, timbers. And that's kind of what it is. I mean, Manchin and Sinema are either going to give a veto to Senate Republicans over whether the federal government acts to protect voting rights against the biggest offensive against it in over 130 years, or they are going to let Republicans do this. And even, it's so extraordinary. I just point out, as I pointed out in a story, as Congressman Sarbanes was the first one to make this observation to me, who was one of the sponsors of HR 1 in the House. And then I went back and looked at it. The standard that Manchin and Sinema are setting is utterly ahistoric. I mean, they are basically saying that Washington should respond to what Republicans in the states are doing only if Republicans in the Senate agree to restrain what their colleagues in the states are doing. Well, after the Civil War, the 14th and 15th Amendments only passed because Senate Republicans at that time, the majority party, did not give Senate Democrats a veto. No Democrat in either chamber voted for either the 14th or 15th Amendment because they were still allied with the predominantly Democratic Confederates who had left the Union. And the Senate Republicans did not say, well, only if the allies of the Confederates agree to the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution will we vote for it. They did it because they knew they did it on a party line basis because they knew it was important for the basic structure of rights in the country. And that is the test I think Manchin and Sinema are so grievously failing, and is to me much more significant than whether they come around, what number they come around to on the reconciliation bill.
I want to go to questions from our viewers. First of all, it is 1-0 apparently.
Yes.
Cardinals in favor, or in the Cardinals' favor at the moment in the game at Dodger Stadium. So you've indicated pretty clearly, I think, that nobody knows what Senator Sinema's end game is, or what exactly she has in mind. But Manchin, you think, might be amenable to change the filibuster with regard to the voting. Would that put enough pressure on her? Do you have any reason to know to cause her to do the same thing, either there or well, leave it there first.
Well, I should say, I think I want to rephrase the question slightly. I believe that Manchin will make a reasonable deal on reconciliation. He came out against the voting rights bill in June with this scorched earth op-ed, throwing thunderbolts left and right. And then he negotiated a deal that Democrats found surprisingly congenial. I think the odds are something like that on reconciliation. For example, he says he wants to spend 1.5 trillion. Well, by my count, there's roughly $1 trillion of the 3.5 that are tax cuts. So could you kind of get him to a position where he says, well, I'll spend 1.5 trillion and I'll cut another 600 billion in taxes, or I'll spend 1.4 and I'll cut 6 or 7. Like, I can imagine all of that. And the expectation without evidence is among all the voting rights groups and civil rights groups is that Manchin would not have gone to all of the trouble to renegotiate a voting rights bill around his stated objections. And by the way, he did move in some ways. He was not like, here I am, take it or leave it. He moved on a lot of things from what he put out in July or whenever it was to what they introduced in September. But the theory has been that he would not go through all of that trouble, put his name on the bill, renegotiate the bill, go through this public exercise of trying to find 10 Republicans, if he was going to let them just kill it at the end of the line through the filibuster. I don't think anybody knows that, but they're hoping that that means that he will vote to end the filibuster for this. All along, to the questioner's assumption, the assumption among basically everyone has been that if he folds or sees the light, Sinema would not stand alone as the one person to go down in history of blocking a response to this historic threat of voting rights. I personally am less confident of that than I was. I didn't have any reason to be confident of it 4 months ago, but I just kind of, like many reporters, like, oh, it's conventional wisdom. If you get Manchin, you get Sinema. I'm less sure because, like, it's hard for me to see what her end game is here. The most logical, she could not stand alone to kill the Democratic agenda on the budget, and or voting rights if she intends to maintain herself as a Democrat, right? Like if she wants to be the Democratic Senate nominee in Arizona in 2024, and she single-handedly sinks voting rights legislation and or Biden's economic agenda, and Democrats get wiped out in 2022 by the combination of backlash and voter suppression, she is either going to lose a Democratic primary or face a very serious challenge on the left. So you would say that if she plans on continuing as a Democrat, it would be hard to do that. But what if she doesn't? What if she plans on running as an independent? Maybe she thinks that's her path ahead, a kind of Lisa Murkowski 2010, Joe Lieberman 2006 strategy, where they lost their party primary and got reelected in the middle. So I guess it's a long way of saying that on balance, you would still say 51-49, that if Manchin comes along, Sinema will too, but I can now see a scenario where she decides it's even better for her to be the one person standing in the breach. Although what of course makes this so bizarre is that she's at the front lines of this. I mean, Arizona Republicans are passing legislation making it harder to vote, and they have a whole bunch of new legislation teed up for 2021 to make it harder, 2022 to make it harder to vote. And so she is allowing them to create barriers in the way, throw tacks in the road for both Kelly and her, and obviously the Secretary of State who's running for governor, Katie Hobbs, in 2022.
Okay, there were a lot of questions about Senator Sinema, and I think you've answered them all. Here's something we haven't talked about at all. W. Goldberg asks, why are the Republicans so quiet about the Texas abortion law? Are they regretting what's been done there?
I think that there's the question, who's the they in that sentence? There are other red states that are waiting to move ahead in this direction. There's no question about it. I think at the national level, I think Republicans understand that this is probably more than the market will bear politically, and that if the Supreme Court upholds the Mississippi law, much less the Texas law, that many of the trends they have seen in recent years of college-educated white women and younger single women moving toward the Democratic Party would probably get even more intense. The open question, the gender gap, and by the way, as Hispanic and even some much lesser extent Black men have moved toward the Republican Party in 2020, the gender gap for Latinos is really big too, and for African Americans is really, Democratic Party do better among women of basically every condition. One question would be, would an abortion law that strict hurt even the women they count on the most, which are the non-college white women that are key to their success in many of the Rust Belt states, and where Biden did not do as well as the pre-election polling indicated he would. I mean, those women stayed pretty Republican, and right now his numbers among them are terrible. Among all non-college whites, they're like back in the 20s, they're like at Hillary levels. Again, a sign of the, we were talking about before, the sign of the success of Republicans are kind of branding this whole thing as a socialist attempt to transform America. I think they worry about that. I don't think they see this as their winning fight at the national level. I mean, they want to talk about critical race theory and the border. I mean, they want, and the Trump, part of the Trump leverage or fulcrum that he functioned in the Republican Party was to shift the wedge issues from the traditional cultural issues like gay rights, LGBTQ rights, and abortion toward race, flat out, policing, the border, critical race theory, things like that. And I don't think they really want a full-scale fight over abortion.
Ray wants to know, if a voting rights law of some kind were passed, what chance would it have with the U.S. Supreme Court? Yeah,
I think that's a real risk. I mean, John Roberts, started his career in the Reagan Justice Department as a lawyer opposed to the voting rights, and has been incredibly consistent. When his desire for the court to be seen as nonpartisan collides with the political interests of the Republican Party, the latter almost always wins. The only one you can think of where it didn't was adding the citizens group question to the census. But Shelby County, the decision 5-4 in 2013 that he wrote, opened the door. I mean, that was the starting gun for this historic wave of voter suppression that we're seeing. And of course, he wrote that, discrimination in voting is a thing of the past. You know, it's like, I liken that to F. Scott Fitzgerald saying there are no second acts in American lives, which I thought was the most incorrect thing ever famously said, the wrongest famous saying. And I think that Roberts, it's like the wrongest single, you know, assertion in a Supreme Court decision that I can think of, the most incorrect. You know, the expectation is that he would be very hostile. And even with the new Voting Rights Act that's been reintroduced today in the Senate after passing the House, that establishes a new system for, quote, pre-clearance, unquote, pre-clearance was the Section 5 of the original Voting Rights Act, requiring that states with a history of discrimination pre-clear changes in voting laws with the Justice Department. That would have given the Obama Justice Department and certainly the Biden Justice Department the capacity to block many of the things that are happening now. They have a new formula for doing that. He might strike that one down too. The problem he's got is the elections clause in the Constitution, which gives Congress clearly the authority over the states in setting the rules for elections that deal with Congress. And the vast majority of scholars think also with the presidency connected to that. But look, is it possible that these 5 or 6 justices could create the last ruling on the Voting Rights Act? Judge Alito created entirely out of thin air a whole series of new constraints and limits on application of the law. So yeah, they could, but the elections clause in the Constitution, I think, is a limit on what they can do.
We've almost acted as if the Democrats are unified in every respect, and of course they're not. Alan wants to know, what's the impact of AOC and the squad on the prospects for the Democrats working something out?
Look, you're talking to someone who, you know, covered the DLC from the beginning and the Democratic Leadership Council, who have generally believed that the centrists have been more responsible players in the Democratic Party than the left over the last 35 years. But they are not the problem now. The left is not the problem. The center is the problem, and not even the center broadly defined. Manchin, Sinema, and a handful of House members who, for their own political reasons, have decided that they want to be seen as throwing sand in these gears and maybe ultimately sinking the thing. There is a deal to be had with AO. I do not see the squad voting down a $2 trillion, or even if it was, you know, expansion of the federal investment and public investment and the safety net. And, you know, they have, I do not see them rejecting the Manchin reconfigured voting rights bill as insufficient if it comes back to the House. Just that is not where the problem is now. The problem is a handful of Democrats in each chamber at a time when you're operating with very narrow margins.
Carol wants to know, what benefits do the Republicans get now by being anti-vaccination?
It's a really, look, it's a great question. I would say that the history of the Republican Party going back to impeachment, Bill Clinton in 1998, I think is the turning point on what I'm about to say, which is that Republicans since then, because of the way the geography of the electorate works, have for a lot of reasons, the rise of talk radio and Fox News, the small state tilt in the Electoral College and the Senate, the decline in the number of truly competitive House districts, for all those reasons, they have decided that opinion within their coalition is more important than opinion overall, nationally overall. And the number of Republicans willing to confront majority opposition the number of Republicans willing to do something that's supported by a majority of the country, but opposed by a majority of their base, has steadily diminished. Bush did it sometimes, immigration reform being the biggest example, even No Child Left Behind in some ways, but that has just eroded and eroded and eroded. And so they are playing to the short side of the field. I mean, they are reflecting the intensity of a portion of their base. I mean, about half Republicans are vaccinated and half Republicans aren't vaccinated. Maybe it's probably changed. That's the last time I looked. It's probably like 56-44, 57-43 now. Among unvaccinated Republicans, 90+% oppose everything. They oppose vaccine mandates. They oppose vaccine passports. They oppose mask mandates. They are ferociously against it. There are about 1/3 to 45%, depending on the question, of vaccinated Republicans who support all of those things. But there is a risk, I think, as Gavin Newsom showed, there is a risk for Republicans in alienating some of and these are the same voters that they've been losing anyway, kind of suburban college educated voters, by being so doctrinaire, by siding. All of their messaging is about the rights and the choices of the unvaccinated. They do have a risk of alienating some of those vaccinated Republicans, but I think this just fits in with their long-term belief that the answer to every political problem is to mobilize, energize, stoke the base.
Ron asks, are there issues, do you think, that could help the Democrats in 2022? I presume that's all contingent on what happens in the Senate.
Yes. Okay, so let's go back to something I said before. I think the history is that it's hard to turn legislative achievement in a president's first year into political achievement in the second year. No matter how much you get done in the first year, you usually lose seats in the second year. I mean, the most productive Congress since World War II was the 1965 Great Society Congress. They passed Medicare, they passed Medicaid, they passed the Voting Rights Act, they passed National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. I think they passed the first clean air. I mean, it's incredible. They lost 47 seats. All right. After all that, they lost 47 seats. The biggest conservative policy achievement of my lifetime were the Reagan tax cuts in 1981. They lost 26 seats in the next midterm. Obviously, Obama lost 62 or 63 seats after the ACA. It's hard for and yet all of those things can be valuable. I think if Democrats can pass any semblance of what they're considering now, it will help them in 2024. I mean, universal pre-K, monthly child tax payment, expanded, Medicare benefits, and help for caring for your parents. I think all these things will be popular over time. I don't think people will feel them enough in 2022 to believe it really happened. I think the key for 2022 is, above all, getting the virus under control and giving people more of a sense that life is kind of moving in the right direction. I think the midterms, are more a referendum on conditions in the country rather than the legislative agenda. I haven't written this yet. I've talked about it a lot. I just don't see the history of basically, I mean, logically, presidents get the most done in their first year and they lose the most seats in their second year, right? I mean, it's like, with the exception of Roosevelt in 34, that's sort of been the pattern all the way through. So I think that if Biden, look, Democrats, it's hard to hold the House. Since the Republicans have to win 5 seats. Since 1870, in every midterm since 1870, the party out of power has won at least 5 seats, all but 5 times in 140 years. So, it ain't easy. Now, Senate's a little more different. Senate can be a little more independent. But I think if they do have a chance of avoiding the worst, it's kind of an 0-2 circumstance where Bush did avoid losses in the midterm. And it was because the country had kind of come together after 9/11, and they felt that he was responding effectively to the crisis. And I think that's the precedent that was there for Biden. If he can get the virus under control, and I think that's why they ultimately decided to go down the road of vaccination mandates that they didn't want to do in the first place, because they thought that the risk of allowing the virus to persist was even greater than the risk of provoking the right through the vaccine mandates.
One issue that you wanted to expand on earlier, and I said I would give you a chance, was the question of how states vote in terms of political party for the Senate as opposed to the presidency itself.
Yeah, let me do that really fast. I mean, the basic transformation is that our politics are becoming more parliamentary, both in the way that the members themselves vote with incredibly high levels of party consensus, even though it doesn't look that way, with the 2 who are saying no so visibly, but the way voters are treating it is becoming more parliamentary as well. I mean, the name on the back of the jersey doesn't matter as much as the color on the front of the jersey. It is almost impossible now for either party to win Senate seats in states that usually vote the other way for president. I mean, there are 25 states that voted for Biden. Democrats now have 47 of their 50 Senate seats. There are 25 states that voted for Trump. Republicans now have 47 of their 50 Senate seats. If you pull back the lens a little bit further, there are 20 states that have voted the same way in each of the past 4 presidential elections for Democrats. 20 states voted Democratic, 4 for 4 since 08. Democrats have 39 of their 40 Senate seats. 20 states have voted Republican, 4 for 4. Republicans have 38 of their 40 Senate seats. So since about half the states kind of lean toward each party, and since you very rarely see somebody win a Senate seat now in a state that usually votes the other way for president, what that means is that the kind of the equilibrium, the water level is really close to 50-50 in the Senate. I mean, that's sort of what you get to, that to get to 53 or 54 or 55 is now like it requires a big short-term shift. But at the same time, what is the other implication of this is that if you go back and you look at the 70s and 80s and 90s, in many of those years, the big deal makers in the Senate were the senators who came from divided constituencies. They were senators who won in states that often voted for the other side for president. Southern Democrats like John Breaux or Sam Nunn, or coastal Republicans like Jacob Javits and later Packwood and Hatfield. They had an intrinsic interest in tamping down partisan conflict because they knew that if it came down to a shirts versus skins kind of competition, most of their states would probably go the other way. So they wanted to show that the whole system could kind of work together, and you didn't have to have a Republican if you were Louisiana. You could have a Democrat who kind of made the whole thing work. Now, almost every Democrat is sent to Washington by a state that voted for the Democratic president or against the Republican president, and vice versa for the Republicans. And so their intrinsic electoral incentive is to stand with their side against the other side. And that's why I say this force, this growing alignment between Senate and presidential outcomes at once are creating the conditions where the margins are narrower and the opportunities to get support from the other party is smaller, which is why even John Breaux, for any of you who are old enough to remember John Breaux, the classic centrist Senate dealmaker, wheeler dealer, said to me this week, there has to be a carve out for the filibuster for what he called constitutional issues, voting rights, abortion rights, things like that. He said, because there are not enough centrists in either side to get to 60 on anything. And so if you have a closely and deeply divided Senate with a kind of parliamentary voting, the filibuster is even more irrational than it was earlier. And the justification of Manchin and Sinema that it promotes bipartisan cooperation is simply ludicrous. In this world, all the filibuster does is allow the minority to block the majority. And last point, Warren, given the way Republicans are so dominant in smaller, interior, rural, preponderantly white states, today there are 50 senators from each party, as everybody knows. But if you give half of each state's population to each senator, Democrats represent 56% of the population and Republicans 44%. And Manchin and Sinema are creating a situation in which that 44% exercises an absolute veto over everything the majority wants to do that can't be shoehorned into reconciliation.
We have 1 minute left. We heard from at the very beginning of this program. Always like to end on a positive note, if that can be done. Can you do that in the next minute?
Well, look, I would say I do think for the Democrats in the audience, I can't imagine they won't reach a reconciliation deal unless, again, Sinema has decided this is our grand exit from the Democratic Party, because finding a distance between two numbers is what politicians do. And they should be able to do this, 3.5, 1.5, start some programs, phase them out, treat the tax cuts separately than the spending. There's a lot of ways you can find some kind of agreement. The larger question, it's a little harder to be optimistic. You look at everything that's happening, and I do believe we are facing the greatest kind of threat to our coherence as a country since the Civil War. I guess my end note is not so much optimism as exhortation. I think people have to, this is titled America at the Crossroads. I think there were a lot of people who thought that we picked a path out of those crossroads in 2020 when Trump was defeated. And it turned out we haven't. We are even in deeper crisis, I think, today than we were. I mean, certainly if Trump was president and all this was going on, the crisis would be deeper. But relatively speaking, we haven't definitively picked one path. We haven't crossed a road. We are still at kind of the hinge point between whether this country will continue as in the kind of democratic structure that we've known. And I think people have to stay engaged. They can't kind of give in to exhaustion or despair. And this is an ongoing fight around issues that, frankly, none of us have faced in our lifetime, which is whether America will continue as a democracy. And maybe it is a new issue because the real question is, can America continue as a multiracial democracy? That is not something that has a lot of precedent, as scholars far smarter than I have pointed out, around the world or through world history. It is ultimately what we are trying to achieve. And I think that it is not a guarantee that will continue. And so everybody is going to kind of stay in the fight.
Brownstein, very hard to find people who are smarter than you. You are extraordinary with source when it comes to detail and analysis, when it comes to politics. And of course, people shouldn't forget, Don't Rock Me on the Water, which isn't about politics at all.
Rock Me on the Water. Yeah, absolutely. It's a nice, when I wrote the book, Warren, it often felt like a vacation from what we were dealing with every day to go spend time in 1974 LA. You could almost picture yourself in a hot tub somewhere in Malibu on a Saturday night in the book. So I hope people will give it a look.
Well, thanks as always. Next week's program, Rick Hasson, the professor of law at UC Irvine, with Dahlia Lithwick of Slate.com. They'll be talking about the specialty for both of them, the U.S. Supreme Court, and the session that began this week could be one of the most important sessions of the Supreme Court in years. Thank you all for joining us. Be safe, be in good health, wear your mask. See you next time.